Morning. This is another contribution to this debate about the purpose of life. What's the meaning of life? Does it have a meaning? And I guess I'm talking to two videos here. I haven't looked at yours yet, Nick, Modern Mystic. I know you've made a video this morning, which I will look at later, but it's about Matt's video, something like matter, life, soul, spirit, that one, which is lots of brackets. And Gary's, your most recent one, which I think is episode 5 in the exciting series. Okay, Matt, yours first. Like Gary, I guess you're expecting this. I have some problem with the language here, but I'm trying to accept it for what it is and talk in those terms, the language of soul and spirit. I do have problems with it. I don't have problems with it poetically. I think that's absolutely fine. But it does come loaded with baggage, and you can't really say soul without people thinking of God and immortality and transcendence, and certainly can't say spirit without those things being invoked. So I have some problems, but I'll stay with it for a few minutes. Soul, first off, the reference points I'm having here, and you might be coming from a very different place. The reference points I have to soul. One is James Hillman's idea of the soul code book of his. James Hillman is a kind of Jungian. I'm sure people know, some of you know that, but he's kind of Jungian, interesting bloke. Very skeptical at the same time of lots of psychotherapeutic techniques, but also quite interesting and intelligent about those things. And in the Soul's Code, he has not a great book, but he has this idea of what he calls the acorn theory, which is that everyone's kind of comes into the world not only with DNA genome powered future mapped out for them, and not only with a set of environmental circumstances which are steering them in particular directions. So not just nature nurture, but he's kind of invoking this mythic kind of idea, which is character and calling, as he calls it. In Search of Character and Calling is a subtitle of his book. And it's the role of a parent, he says, to kind of observe this in the child. You might fantasize about how your child does in the future. You might try to advise, but the task of a parent, he says, is to find what the hell you've got. What is this person? What kind of a person is this? What is their character? What is their calling? How can I help them develop it? Which is quite interesting. I don't know how far we get with that. It reminds me of that Cahill Gilbrand thing. Your children are not your children. They are the sons and daughters of life's longing for itself. Gary, you can turn off now. You'll hate this bit. Put your fingers in your ears and go la 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 until I finish. The sons and the daughters of life's longing for itself. They come through you, but they are not from you. And though they are with you, then they belong not to you. Something like that. So it's this idea of, I don't fucking know really. It's just this idea that that not in scientific terms, but in terms of understanding, which is a bit different, which I'll come on to at the end. It's sometimes useful to invoke kind of stories and poems or something like that to help the understanding, even if the science is a bit of a mismatch sometimes. And soul is part of that in Hillman. Okay, the other soul is Damasio's use of it in a bunch of his books. I think he talks about it in Descartes' Error, and specifically in his most recent book, something about the self. Self comes to mind. And in there, and he uses soul very lightly. I mean, he doesn't go into it. He certainly doesn't do any of the Hillman archetypal psychology stuff. He just uses it as kind of another kind of language to help you understand the science. Because his science is good. He's thorough in that area. But he's talking about his use of soul is really about maps. I mean, when he's talking scientifically, he talks about neurological maps, and he talks about where in the brain they find these things, which point of evolutionary development these maps came into being, how these maps relate to biological and ecological functioning, all those kind of things. But when he's talking in a slightly different way, he talks about them in terms of souls. So it's important that he's not talking about soul in a religious sense. He's just using that as a shorthand for these maps. There's a different way to think about it. But what he says is that the kind of that there's an area of the brainstem he's talking about, top end of the brainstem, which kind of relates to an Aristotelian idea of the vegetative soul, which is kind of basic body awareness. It's a map of the body's responses, the felt body's responses. and it's it's just like a map of the geology of the Earth. It has that kind of physical certainty about it, and quite honestly, the map of your body is probably the same as the map of mine, in the same way that my geological map of the Earth is the same as your geological map of the Earth. It's a felt thing, you know what I mean? But it's very, very basic, and it doesn't, and it's not. I think he calls it the proto self somewhere else. It's not felt as an individual is felt. It's just kind of responsive. It's just responsive. There's no I created in there to do the feeling. It's just the feeling of being. And that's the kind of proto-self functioning of these very basic organisms. I mean, you traces the actual brain structure down to invertebrates, but certainly most all animals. Anything that's got a central nervous system and the beginnings of a brain has got this bit he's talking about. And that's like your basic map. It's the basic map of the geology of the Earth with which you are. You know what I mean? I don't mean that in any kind of mystical sense. Just that it provides the platform on which other kinds of sentience are based. And then we and other animals, of course, have got all kinds of other maps laid on top of that, just as a map of the Earth has maps laid on top of it. It has maps of human geography. It has maps of towns and counties. It has maps of city-states. It may have even maps of road systems, and it has maps of population density and population flow. And then it has very transitory maps, doesn't it? Or something like Google Earth might have very transitory maps of, I don't know, ones that change almost overnight, like the migration patterns of buffalo or something, I don't know. But these maps we have, in Damasio, we have kind of correlates of that. We have this very basic map, the proto-self, the vegetative soul, which is the map that you and I have, and we've all got this kind of thing. And then we've got all these other maps in different parts of our brain which map different relationships to our body and to the outside world and so on. Whew, God, yeah, that was hard work. But he calls that the soul anyway, and so it's a problematic term. But for me, if I can just hold on to the idea that when you're using the term soul, Matt, you're using it in something like Damasio's sense. I'm choosing to interpret it in those terms. Something like Damasio's sense with perhaps a wee bit of Hillman's kind of mythic archetypal psychology wrapped around it to give it some narrative gravity. Okay, spirit, hugely problematic. The nearest I can get to understanding spirit as a term is something like coming out of, what's your man? Augustine. Augustine has these three parts of the self, I think, or three parts of the body, and this is fucking hundreds of years ago, isn't it? But he has the corporeal self, the body, and then he has these two other things, which he calls the spiritual and the intellectual. I think I'm right in saying this. It's ages since I've had a look at this. The spiritual and intellectual. So you've got your body thing in Augustine, which is all the drives and the desires, which for Augustine, he's writing as a Christian theologian. So of course this is all fallen flesh stuff. But this is the body, and it's just and its desires, and then you've got the spiritual, which in Augustine is something like persistence of memory. It's got that kind of personal thing. He talks about you look at something, you look away, and the thing stays around, and that's its kind of spiritual existence, something like that. And then you've got the intellectual, which is the highly abstract knowledge. And I think if he was writing post 16th century, he would have probably been talking there about abstract knowledge in terms of things like mathematics or of logic. And that's the nearest point of contact I can find with that. When you're talking about spirit, I'm kind of wrapping up Augustine's intellectual and spiritual into a bunch and saying that's what Matt means there. He's talking about the kind of knowledge which approaches the condition of the disembodied, not the kind of personal knowledge that my body is giving me on a changing basis, not the migration patterns of my own caribou inside my body changing the way I feel on a moment-to-moment basis, but the kind of stuff that persists and the kind of stuff that can achieve the abstract quality of something like mathematics or some kind of logic or physics, the laws of physics or something like that. So that's what I'm choosing to interpret what you mean by physics. Yeah, I don't know if that makes any sense. Yeah, okay. I can't remember what else you said, Matt. Sorry. I'll have to come back to it. Anyway, to go on to you, Gary. Yeah, okay. there's two things to say about this bit really. I mean, the first is, I mean, there's a cleft stick, which I'm sure you've recognised. Oh, for fuck's sake, somebody's coming in. Anyway, there's a cleft stick here, which is a paradox, which you've identified and have been identified before. One is this idea that. I'll stop it and come back. Okay, it's about an hour and a half later, so I'm going to try and retrack my steps. Just put my Tommy Cooper sideburns down. Okay, cleft stick, Gary. The excuse me, just a sandwich. The okay, the yeah, it's this thing about, I guess, futility or pointlessness of purpose. I want to just talk to that first, because there's two aspects of that, isn't there? I think, and then both those aspects are in contradistinction to something else, or might be. The first is to do with the first reason why the pointlessness, why we might think this world is pointless, is because of something you say in your video guide, which is just to do with scale. You know, we are a tiny little life forms clinging to a grain of sand on a beach with 100 billion stars in it in this galaxy, I believe, and our galaxy is one of 100 billion galaxies or something. You know, so and we live for in a tiny length of time. You know, I've done some videos in near the cliffs in Cornwall, you know, and you know, I can't help noticing. You look at the sedimentation layers on those cliffs, and you're looking at a million years when you do that, aren't you? Really, you know what I mean? And I could put my hand on one of those cliff on the side of that cliff, and my hand would completely cover the entirety of human history. You know what I mean? If it was in scale terms, you know, you got a 150-foot cliff, and the entirety of everything we hold dear can be covered up with the width of a palm. You know, so it's a tiny fragment of time on a tiny fragment of sand in a huge, colossally vast thing. So you know, it just reduces the just on that ground, it just feels trivial and stupid and pointless, and all of these ambitions and these grand gestures that we make and these symphonies that we write and the great scientific discoveries we make, you know, in perspective, it's pretty small fry stuff, isn't it? So on the one hand, there's that kind of pointlessness, and then there's a second kind of pointlessness, which you mentioned, which is to do with, you know, what is the purpose of purpose? Which, you know, when we think about purpose, what are we really talking about? What is this sense of this this quest for meaning, or the quest for what is the meaning of life, or this idea that we should be thinking about our purposes? I mean, of course, you know, that sense, like every other sense we have, like every other feeling we've ever had, is built out of the raw materials of our biology and our psychology. You know, the sense of purpose is the sense of purpose as derived through the history of life on this planet. And like you, I have some reservations about the wisdom of this particular piece of machinery. It's a set of purposes built out of desires which, you know, I've used all kinds of methods to achieve those ends. So yeah, it's not only is the purpose trivial in the great scheme of things, it's also a purpose which is derived from a fairly unpleasant mechanism. So when you unpick the nature of purpose, it itself feels slightly less friendly than I would want. So there's those two things. So on the one hand, what that should encourage us to do, it doesn't, but what it should encourage us to do is just say, all right, okay, and this I did try to do this, but I don't succeed. What that should allow us to do is to get a kind of mature recognition of our position and say, God, this is stupid. I'm just going to put this down like childish things. You know, I'm just going to set it aside like childish things, because it's like through a glass darkly. It's that kind of thing. I'm going to just set this aside. Like I realise this is just a tiny little playground, and all this purpose stuff is a bit nonsense. I'm just not going to bother with it. But at the same time, you know, we're in it, aren't we? You know, we're in the playground. We're driven by desires. And the most elevated of our thoughts can be traced back to those same kinds of desires. So, and those things are operating right now. You know, not just positives, but the negatives. You know, we look around us and we see people in grave torment, or we see roadkill by the side of the road. I thought you saw about 8 dead animals by the side of the road this morning so far. You know, all of whom have been squashed flat. a badger in two parts, actually, separated by about 100 yards. So, you know, this is the kind of thing we are kind of surrounded by, and that's pretty hard to take, isn't it, really? So it's not even easy to do the detach with love thing or detach with indifference thing. You know, it's hard to say it is pointless universe. I'm just going to not care because we are involved in the caring process. So so I don't know what you do there really. So it is we are in that process. But I mean, what yours? I mean, the weird thing, which is it is I guess is a question back to you here, Gary, is to do with the oddness of purpose. You know, because in some of your videos, Gary, you know, you've got this imaginary red button, you bang the damn button. You know, that is such a purposive act. I mean, it's loaded with purpose, isn't it? You know what I mean? You see a future, you see um, all the negatives, and you see suffering, and you see pointlessness, and you see an end game which is futile in its most abject sense. And so you deliberate about this, you reflect on it, and you set yourself the objective of hitting the button and putting an end to that game, which is itself purposive. I mean, that's the weird thing about this, isn't it? You know what I mean? That even in your negation, the negation is itself a purpose. You know, there is. You know what I mean? You can't be inactive. You can't be. Oh, I don't know. You probably got what I'm saying by now. So that's that really. And yeah, I mean, what I wish, and this is a bit different. This kind of returns to the thing. When I was trying to come up with this video, I started jotting down a bunch of terms which I've been using, you've been using, Nick, Matt uses all the time, various people use. And these are things like value, purpose, accomplishment, problem, you used to use the word problem, Gary, and things like solve or fail to solve, decision, choice, believe, need, meaning, potential, futility, sense. And all these terms, you know, but all these terms are all about the human condition, aren't they? I mean, and sentient conditions. Because we can signify and use language, we can put them into words. But these are all. This is the language of sentience, isn't it? You know, and it's a language of free will, and it's a language of intentional agents, and it's the language of desire, and all the. Oops, it's all the language of the stuff that makes us human. And I kind of wish we could do something with that. You know, I mean, I did piss about playing with talking about the physics of value. You know, whether there was a kind of, you know, like Boolean logic. Boolean logic takes these terms like and, not, if, then, these kinds of words, and turns them into kind of mathematical symbols. So you can use analytical logic to play with what are actually language concepts and drive truth forward by using analysis. I mean, I kind of wish we had an equivalent, almost to physics or a kind of logical language, which took those terms, value, purpose, problem solving, decision, need, meaning, which took these terms and kind of related them to one another. You know what I mean? Maybe that's something I'll kick around and see what I can do with. Not that it would provide an answer to it, it would just provide the mathematics for that system. You know what I mean? So we can start thinking of it as a system rather than it being just a set of feelings and intuitions and proposals for action. You know what I mean? Or not. Anyway, yeah, that's it really. The only other thing I wanted to say was cancer as a universe. I think cancer's got a very bad name. I don't mean to offend anybody by that. Some of my relatives have died of cancer. So, but maybe, you know, you talked about in one of your videos about skin, you know what I mean? Like your skin cancer. I thought maybe I'm talking about something else. Like if skin just became alive and that became the world and it became rock cancer and the cancerous rock spread out. Maybe that wouldn't be so bad, really. Maybe that wouldn't be so bad if we had, yeah, just that kind of life, really. Or just plant life. That would be the alternative I go for. Anyhow, enough. Not very coherent. Perhaps if you've got the mechanism to speed this up, I realise how slowly I speak. If you've got the mechanism to speed this up, do that. Anyway, speak to you all later. Bye.